You are standing on the cobbled streets of ancient Lydia, a quiet morning settling over the small city of Colophon. The sun has not yet burned away the early fog, and the town is just beginning to stir. Traders prepare baskets of purple dye and woven goods for the marketplace. There's a hum of industry, slow, methodical, ordinary. But among the ordinary, there is a name whispered across doorways. She is not a queen or priestess. She is not the daughter of some glorious warlord or oracle. Arachne is a weaver's daughter, born to a modest craftsman who dyed wool for a living. Yet her name carries weight, not with grandeur, but with a kind of irritation and awe. For her weaving was not simply skilled, it was unnervingly perfect. You would not know her on sight. She looked like many other girls of her age, her hands worn and calloused from hours at the loom. But when she sat at the frame, thread in hand, she became something else entirely. The stories say that the gods themselves took notice. In this part of the world, Lydia, nestled in western Anatolia, textile work was one of the most important crafts of the time. Weaving was an act of daily survival, but also something more. It was a way to tell stories, subtle messages in the threads. Arachne's talent, then, was not only rare, it was, in a quiet way, dangerous. Priests would display her cloth on temple tables, calling it a tribute to the gods, even though Arachne herself never seemed particularly pious. She does not thank Athena. She says it's her own skill, as if mortal hands can create such perfection without divine help. To claim to be her equal in craft was not merely a boast, it was a challenge. "My hands are my own," she told a curious traveler one day. "If the goddess thinks herself better, let her come and prove it." One day, an old woman appeared at Arachne's workshop. "Thank the gods for your gifts." The old woman vanished in a shimmer of light. There stood Athena, grayed and solemn. At last, Athena spoke. "You have spoken, mortal. Now, let us weave." The fire has long since burned low in the workshop, its coals glowing faintly beneath a thick layer of ash. The loom sits quiet now, a few loose threads hanging from its frame, swaying gently in the airless stillness. You can almost imagine the scent: wool, old wood, a faint trace of smoke. This is the aftermath. After the contest, after the tearing, after the transformation. But for Arachne, the story wasn't over. Not really. Transformation is never the end. In Greek myth, it's a turning point, a punishment, yes, but also a strange kind of continuation. You see, the ancient Greeks did not always imagine punishment as cruelty. It was more like balance being restored. Arachne became a spider, and in doing so, she became a symbol not of defeat, but of the unending act of weaving, of silent persistence. But let's not leap ahead. There's something curious in how this myth was remembered, and more importantly, where it was remembered. For although Arachne's story is most famously recorded in the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, its roots are tangled much earlier in oral tradition. The wealth of Lydia's kings, especially the famously rich Croesus, was built in part on this soft, colorful industry. So when we speak of Arachne, we are not speaking of a myth in isolation. We are speaking of a society that worshipped the loom. In a way, Arachne's true offense was not just arrogance, it was claiming mastery of something considered divine and human. Athena does not gloat. She does not declare victory. She destroys the tapestry and transforms the girl, not out of joy, but out of something more complex. Perhaps fear, perhaps jealousy, or perhaps, simply, the heavy burden of being a god who must maintain order even when the mortal before her speaks a truth too bold to ignore. Arachne's tapestry did tell the truth. The gods were flawed, and her skill made it impossible to look away. Let's pause here and imagine the scene again, but from a different angle. There is no record of this girl, of course. Myth does not remember such people, but history is made of them. Because Arachne, in the end, did not stop weaving, it is likely that the myth of Arachne survived not because of temples or poets, but because of weavers. There is one version of the myth, that she could not deny the beauty of her skill. The spider does not stop. It does not question its task. It wakes, it weaves, it eats, it weaves again. There is no audience, no glory, just the motion, the labor, the thread. And yet, in that endless pattern, something remains. The shape of a myth, not passed down in scrolls or temples, but in habit, in motion. The story of Arachne is not just what was told, it's what was done. Athena may no longer walk the earth in armor, but her symbols remain. And Arachne, she weaves still, not because she was told to, not because she must, but because she was made for it. Every time a weaver tightens the warp, somewhere in the quiet hum of the thread, Arachne's name stirs. She is no longer a girl, not even a spider. She is an action, a gesture, a legacy. In the beginning, the fates spun the world. In the end, so if you see a spider at night, pause, don't crush it, let it weave, because somewhere in the hush of midnight threads, in the silence between stories, something ancient still moves. Now, close your eyes and imagine the city of Rome, not the Rome of marble palaces and triumphal arches, not the Rome of emperors and legions, but a Rome of alleyways, damp cobblestones, and the low, ever-present smell of something faintly sour. It is morning. You are walking past a row of shops beneath crumbling apartment buildings, where laundry flutters from upper windows like flags. And you stop, not at a temple, not at a bakery, but at a peculiar little building with steam drifting lazily from its open door. You've reached the Phalanaka, the Roman laundry. The Phalanaka was where the real cleansing of Roman life happened. Not the spiritual kind, not the political kind, the literal, physical, grimy business of scrubbing togas, tunics, and linens until they were almost white again. And it was ... complicated. In a world without soap, without electricity, and without running water, at least in every home, washing clothes required a system. And that system, like much of Roman life, involved an ingenious combination of practicality, unpleasantness, and public funding. Let's begin with the people who worked here. They were called Felonies professional, launderers. Most were freedmen or lower-class citizens working in small teams inside workshops located in back alleys or attached to public baths. Some were family-run, passed down through generations. Others were part of larger commercial networks that served the needs of Rome's elite. The work was intense, constant, and never truly finished. There was always more cloth to clean, always another stain to lift. But how did they do it? Let's walk through the process. The first step was soaking. Large stone basins, think of them like ancient bathtubs, were filled with water and something else, human urine. Yes, that's right. Roman laundry was powered by urine. You see, urine contains ammonia, which is a natural cleaning agent. The Romans, though they did not understand the chemical structure, had long observed its ability to lift grease and grime from fabric, so they collected it. Public urinals, called pholenike amphorae, were stationed throughout the city. Citizens would relieve themselves into jars, and the contents were collected, sometimes taxed, and delivered to laundries in large clay containers. This was not a metaphor. This was the empire. Once the clothes had soaked, the Phallones got to work. They would climb into the vats, barefoot, and stomp the garments like grapes, kneading, pressing, turning the cloth beneath their heels. The smell was strong, the labor constant, and yet the results were effective. The Phallones then rinsed the garments several times using clean water, often fetched from nearby aqueduct-fed fountains. Brushes and wooden paddles were used to beat out the remaining dirt. Then came drying clothes were wrung out and laid over woven mats, rooftops, or wooden frames in the sun. Some Phallones also offered rebrighting services, dusting the finished cloth with white chalk or fuller's earth to give it that bright, crisp look favored by wealthy clients, especially for togas. White meant status, and fullers made that possible. It was not glamorous work, but it was essential. There are frescoes in Pompeii, soft, faded now, showing fullers at work. One shows a man hanging a tunic, while another stirs a vat. Another shows a customer paying, pointing at his newly brightened toga with a look of mild satisfaction. And yes, these shops often had signs, painted slogans above the door, like Best Wash in the Forum or Whitest Togas in Trastevere, a blend of advertising and artistry. Some even included blessings to Minerva, the goddess of crafts and workers. But perhaps what makes this story most quietly fascinating is how vital this trade was and how it vanished. Because in the centuries after Rome's fall, the Phallonica disappeared. The techniques were lost. The practice of collecting urine for cleaning slowly faded into legend. The knowledge of cloth chemistry, so deeply woven into Roman daily life, slipped through the cracks. And yet, even now, historians can trace these steps. In the grooves of stone basins, in the ghosts of workshops found beneath medieval streets, in the layers of soot and ammonia dust still clinging to buried floors, history, like fabric, holds a scent. You just have to be still long enough to notice. And so we begin this story, not with battles or emperors, but with a man standing ankle-deep in sour water, humming quietly as he beats a toga against smooth stone. The sun is rising. Another tunic waits its turn, and the city, above and around him, goes on pretending that its whiteness comes without effort. But beneath every statue, someone is stomping. The business of dirt beneath the towering aqueducts and echoing baths of Rome, laundry became big business. We often imagine the Roman world through marble statues and clean togas. But the reality was far messy, and keeping it clean required structure, contracts, and clever economics. That's where the fullers became more than just laborers. They became businessmen. And like all businesses in Rome, laundry was deeply entangled with politics, patronage, and the slow grind of regulation. To run a Phallonica in a city like Rome or Pompeii meant dealing with two major forces, local guilds and municipal oversight. While Phallones weren't the most prestigious workers, they had enough influence to form their own associations. These guilds set prices, lobbied for protections, and even funded statues or public works in honor of their trade. One famous inscription from Ostia, port town just outside Rome, shows a fuller donating funds for the restoration of a temple staircase. His name appears beneath the words fuller and citizen of good standing. A man who had, quite literally, made his way up the social ladder by scrubbing others' robes. But it wasn't just money that gave Fullers standing. It was visibility. Imagine the average Roman citizen. He walks through town in his best tunic, freshly whitened. His toga is spotless, despite the dusty streets and crowded bathhouses. When someone compliments it, he doesn't thank the gods. He thanks his fuller. And yet, for all their practical value, fullers remained peripheral. They were respected in that odd Roman way of respecting something necessary but unpleasant, like sewers or taxation. Which brings us to the curious moment when Roman emperors taxed urine. Yes, that actually happened. During the reign of Emperor Vespasian in the 1st century CE, Rome faced budget shortages after years of civil war. So, Vespasian did what many rulers do. In hard times, he looked for new revenue. He realized that fullers depended heavily on public urine collection points. So, he imposed a tax on the collection and sale of urine, known as the vectigal urinate. Merchants who bought urine to sell to laundries were required to pay this tax. And in doing so, they transformed waste into taxable wealth. There's a famous anecdote involving Vespasian's son, Titus, who questioned the dignity of such a tax. In response, Vespasian held up a coin to his nose and said, "Pecunia non olet," money does not stink. It became a proverb. And in time, a plaque was placed above the public urinals in Rome. Pecunia non olet. Even filth can fund an empire. Meanwhile, down in the vats, the fullers kept stomping. The work never slowed. In fact, as Roman fashion grew more elaborate with added embroidery, multicolored trims, and finer materials, cleaning it became more delicate, more specialized. Some fullers adapted, offering color-safe rinsing and fabric stretching techniques. Others carved out niches, whitening wool, softening linen, removing oil stains from silk. A few even claimed 2-cent garments, though what they used remains a mystery best left to the imagination. And for the wealthiest clients, there was home service. Traveling fullers who brought tubs and paddles to aristocratic villas, laboring quietly in tiled courtyards while children played and scribes took dictation. Yet, no matter how refined the setting, the work remained the same. Trample, rinse, dry, dust, fold. The rhythm of the Phalanaka was eternal. No hour of the day passed without movement, and inside these walls, life unfolded in parallel. Children of the workers played between vats. Apprentices learned the weight of wet wool by touch. Arguments broke out over misplaced tunics. Meals were shared on low stools beside steaming basins. Laughter echoed off stone, sometimes tears. And above it all, the smell, unmistakable, strong, not quite foul, not quite clean, just ... human. History rarely pauses here. It prefers to tell stories of emperors, philosophers, and soldiers. But it is worth remembering that the whiteness of every senator's robe, the crispness of every festival gown, was bought with the labor of people whose names are mostly lost. People who knew the trick of balancing cloth on a paddle with just 3 fingers, Who could tell cotton from wool in the dark? Who could sense, without looking, when a tunic had been in the vat exactly long enough? They were not artists, not soldiers, not heroes, but they kept the city presentable. And in a world where presentation was everything, that meant something. But eventually, even this system began to fray, and the reasons were many. By the late 4th century CE, the Roman world was shifting, not suddenly, not loudly, but like a garment slowly unraveling at the seams. Trade routes grew unreliable, coinage devalued. Roads, once humming with carts and sandals, fell silent under wind-blown dust, and the Phalanca, so long a fixture of city life, began to vanish. Not because the people no longer needed clean clothes, they did, but because the empire no longer had the infrastructure to support it. The aqueducts, with their marvelous arches and gleaming channels, began to crumble. The public fountains grew clogged with moss. The urine jars, once emptied daily, stood, forgotten in the corners of alleys, attracting flies rather than tax collectors, and the fuller. Many simply disappeared from the record. Their workshops, once noisy and foul-smelling, went quiet. Their tools were buried under layers of ash in Pompeii. Their basins, emptied of water and waste, cracked in the sun. Some historians suggest that Christianity's growing influence may have also changed public attitudes toward trades like fulling. The emphasis on spiritual purity replaced the old obsession with visual whiteness. The toga, once the pinnacle of Roman dress, faded from fashion. Simpler tunics took over. With it, the art of extreme laundering slipped into the background. It's easy to lose this kind of history. It doesn't come with monuments or poems. No. One wrote an ode to the best chalk duster of the Aventin Hill. No statue was raised for the man who could wring out a toga with a single twist. Their names, their routines, their small triumphs and little jokes all gone. And yet, every so often, they resurface in 20th century excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Archaeologists found laundry shops still perfectly preserved, stone basins, drainage systems, even graffiti carved into the walls by bored apprentices, rude jokes, tally marks, and one doodle of a man falling into a vat in one shop. A beautifully painted fresco survives, a bearded man holding a paddle in one hand, a garment in the other, standing proudly beside the words, "I wash whiter than snow." It's an advertisement, a 20-year-old commercial, but it's also something more. It's a tiny declaration. I was here. I worked. I mattered. And maybe that's the quiet magic of this forgotten art. Because while emperors rose and fell, and armies crossed continents, and temples crumbled, the foolers stood in their basins, ankle-deep in ammonia, quietly keeping the world in order, one tunic at a time. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, consider this. Every clean robe in ancient Rome passed through the hands of someone you'll never know. Someone who stomped, rinsed, and folded in silence. Who never expected praise. Who worked by firelight long after the city above had gone to bed. And even now, in the back alleys of time, their footprints remain faint, wet, pressed into stone, waiting to be remembered. Or perhaps simply left in peace. You find yourself wandering through the silent, crumbling mounds of Tel Marduk, where the winds of northern Syria whisper through shallow trenches and half-buried stones. A soft haze of dust settles on everything. Archaeologists called it Ebla, but long ago. It was simply a place where people lived, recorded, stored, and eventually forgot nearly everything they ever wrote. Long before Assyria, Babylon, or even the rise of Babylon, a city-state that held a peculiar obsession with documenting the smallest details of its kingdom, from harvest records and sheep counts to trade transactions involving lapis lazuli and goatskins. Ebla's scribes etched everything onto thousands of clay tablets. These were not grand myths or sagas, but memos, logs, inventory tallies, and royal budget sheets. The city was ruled by bureaucrats who governed not through war or charisma, but through storage. The city was ruled by bureaucrats who governed not through war or charisma, but through storage. Massive archives were tucked inside palace vaults. The scribes, often hunched, underpaid, and largely forgotten, spent their days pressing styluses into wet clay, their hands crusted in dust. They sat under torchlight, transcribing complaints about broken jars, or detailing the number of barley sacks delivered from village 402. These scribes didn't know they were making history. They thought they were simply updating records. The language of Ebla, an early Semitic tongue now long extinct, flowed like dry roots over the parchment of clay. Its scribal school trained generations to master the script, memorize phrases, and above all obey formatting rules. But no one knew this for thousands of years. For most of history, Ebla was not even a footnote. Its archives slept beneath the soil, untouched, while the world turned, wars were fought, and other cities were written about and remembered. Until one quiet day in the 1970s, when a Syrian-Italian dig team unearthed the first fragments, and then more, until thousands of tablets poured from the earth like broken filing cabinets from a forgotten kingdom. What did they say? And why did a civilization so obsessed with recording the mundane vanish so completely? The scribes of Ebla sat cross-legged on woven mats, in rooms lined with jars of clay blanks, styluses carved from reed, and tablets still drying by the hearth. Their lives were quiet, cyclical, and filled with repetition. One would rise before sunrise, light the oil lamp, and begin the day's records, perhaps starting with the tribute log from the nearby town of Armon. Another recorded the rationing of beer for stable workers. A third revised the list of ivory combs sent to a neighboring king's daughter for her betrothal. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was critical. Ebla had built an empire, not on bronze or conquest, but on logistical coordination. Its palace was not a throne room of gold, but a warehouse of scroll shelves, clay archives stacked neatly, some dated with tiny symbols. One document simply read, 14th year of Isherlam's reign, 2 goats missing, blame assigned to herder's nephew. Trade was sacred. Roots reached from Anatolia to Mesopotamia. Lapis from Afghanistan passed through Ebla's gates. Cedar logs came from the Levant. Olive oil, resins, copper, fabrics, and incense all passed through the quiet hands of Ebla's accountants. Every item received a record. Every transaction was matched with another. There were no computers, no ink, no pens, only the ritual of clay and stylus. Their records even included personal letters. Some preserved love notes from a prince to a local baker's daughter. Others documented minor border disputes, villages arguing over palm trees or boundary stones nudged by spring floods. Some tablets recorded religious offerings, but not in poetic terms. They were formulaic. 1 bowl, 3 figs, 1 lamb, left at Temple of Kura. The city's greatest achievement was how it documented itself, not for future glory, but for daily operation. Ironically, this is what preserved it. When Ebla fell, likely to the Akkadians, the archive rooms collapsed, baking the tablets in the resulting fires. What was once mundane was now archaeological gold. And yet, while we know so much about Ebla's filing habits, we know almost nothing about how they felt. Were they proud? Were they bored? Did the scribes sigh as they listed the 48th bale of wool for the day? It is strange how entire lives can survive as ledgers, but their laughter and voices vanish forever. When dust became memory, the rediscovery of Ebla in the 20th century sent a ripple through the world of archaeology, not because of what was found, but because of what it meant. Thousands of tablets, many undeciphered, revealed an ancient kingdom that predated empires and operated like a well-oiled machine of administration. It turned out that for centuries, historians had ignored a massive culture hidden beneath dust, simply because it had not written grand tales or fought flashy wars. But Ebla had a power all its own, the power of boring persistence. The tablets showed early law structures, marriage contracts, shipping routes, economic forecasts, and bureaucratic hierarchies. Some even listed musical instruments: reed flute, bronze bell, animal hide drum. We know what instruments they played, but not the songs. And then, nothing. The city disappeared from history. Its records ended abruptly. Silence followed. Another city was built over its ruins. Time passed. When the modern archaeologists read these clay fragments aloud for the first time in thousands of years, their voices echoed across time. A herder's argument, a brewer's complaint, a princess's dowry, forgotten until remembered. What makes Ebla's story so haunting is not its mystery, but its familiarity. Every modern office, every spreadsheet, every shared folder owes something to this place. They wrote it all down, and we nearly forgot it anyway. Now, as you settle deeper into sleep, you might wonder how many other civilizations wrote everything and still vanished beneath the dust. Before we drift into ancient dreams, don't forget to subscribe to Boring Past Times, where history is calm and nothing ever happens fast. Long ago, in the dust and golden haze of ancient Rome, there came an emperor who did not like the sun, not because it was hot or bright or made marble too warm to sit on, but because he believed he was the sun, or at least a piece of it. They called him Elagabalus. Though it wasn't his first name, it was the one history remembered. He had once been a priest, far from Rome, in a temple surrounded by desert and golden wind. There, he worshipped a god of the sun, a god made of silence, stone, and sky. When the boy was brought to Rome, he did not come quietly. He brought the god with him, not as a myth, not as a belief, but in a cart, a real cart, pulled by camels. Inside was a black stone, smooth and heavy, the god itself. The Romans stared, blinking in the bright light, unsure whether to be impressed, amused, or afraid. Elagabalus was only 14 when they gave him the empire. He didn't win it in battle. He didn't win it in vote. His grandmother had whispered, to the right people, in the right corridors, and suddenly the empire belonged to a boy in desert robes. He sat on a throne too large for him, his feet barely brushing the marble floor. Around him stood generals and advisors with tight mouths and tired eyes. The boy didn't care. He built a temple to his god, right next to the old Roman temples. The others, he said, could wait their turn. He draped his shrine in silks instead of stone. He placed the black stone at the center and told Rome that it now had a new sun. His palace shimmered with perfume. Rose petals floated through the halls. He bathed in water, scented with saffron and honey. He told visitors he wanted to be beautiful for the god. Gold clung to every surface. Musicians played for hours, sometimes days. The walls glowed, the ceilings shimmered. But in the streets, the people began to whisper. They whispered about how he dressed, not in armor, but in veils, about how he danced in the moonlight, about how he prayed to a god no one else knew. They called him strange. They called him soft. They called him a shadow wrapped in too much silk. Still, Elagublis didn't fight back. He didn't order soldiers into the streets. He didn't shout or storm or rage. Instead, he threw more banquets. He handed out more gold. He gave children figs dipped in sugar. He told the people, "The sun shines on everyone, even those who don't like it." And when the city slept, he returned to his temple alone. He lay before the black stone. He whispered questions into the dark and waited. But the stone never spoke. Even so, he believed. He believed even as the senators muttered behind marble doors, even as generals sharpened swords, even as the empire itself began to turn away. Still, he knelt in his silk robes under moonlight in silence, believing. He wore no helmet, only veils, and his robes shimmered in impossible colors, colors no soldier would wear. He said war was too noisy, that gods didn't speak through shouting, but through quiet, through light, through stillness. He asked strange questions. Could a king also be a queen? Could a palace become a temple? Could the sun fall in love with a mortal? He gave away gifts that no one asked for, chariots, coins, whole carts of spices. He threw gold from rooftops. He filled fountains with wine, not to gain power, just because he thought it would be lovely. His dinners lasted until sunrise. Tables of ivory stretched down long halls. Servants dressed as gods served honeyed grapes and wine sweetened with herbs. No speeches, no politics, just feasts, just music, just petals falling gently on marble floors. But the silence began to shift behind. The curtains, power started to fray. The soldiers grew quiet. Not silk and incense, not this. She didn't shout. She simply waited and wrote and sent her owl flying into the night. There was no rebellion, no revolt, just whispers, just meetings, just names scratched off statues and invitations that no longer arrived. And one night, the guard, the Praetorian Guard, who had once been told to protect him, were told instead to remove him. They obeyed both commands without a word. At dawn, they came. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He looked at them and smiled softly. "The sun will rise again," he said. And then, nothing. The temple was closed. The stone god was sent away. The veils were folded. The roses swept up. Rome moved on. It always does. Years passed. His name was scraped from monuments. His portraits melted into coins. The temples he built were dismantled, brick by brick. But forgetting is never perfect. Coins still turned up in dusty stalls. A priest in the east still lit candles for the sun. Somewhere, someone always remembered. Centuries later, scholars uncovered old records, odd scrolls, strange portraits, scattered stories. They weren't sure what to make of him. Was he a villain, a dreamer, a fool, or just a boy who didn't fit the time he was born into? He became a rumor, a shimmer, a shadow in velvet. Some said he wasn't real at all, just a dream sewn into the edges of history. And yet, somewhere in a corner of Rome, a strange garden still grew. No one knew who planted it, but the wind there always smelled like roses. And desert rain, the god never spoke. It was only a stone, after all. But for one boy, once upon a time, it had meant everything. And that is more than nothing. Rome fell. Other empires rose, but above it all, the stars still turned. The same stars that Elagabalus watched in silence, wrapped in gold. Cities burned, kings shouted. But the boy emperor, who never raised his voice, still lingers in whispers, in petals. In the quietest parts of history, you almost didn't hear this story. It nearly stayed buried. But sometimes, boring history slips back into the light, just long enough to be remembered once more. And even now, the sun still rises, quietly, softly. Just like he said it would. In the quiet corridors of Hereford Cathedral, just beside the whispering stone walls, and behind an aging screen of iron, there lies a world hand-drawn, faded, and circular. This is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, the most famous of the medieval maps, sprawling parchment of places, real, imagined, and divine. Measuring over 5 feet tall, it was never meant for navigation. Instead, it was meant to explain the divine order of the world, as seen not by travelers, but by bishops. Instead, you'd find Eden perched somewhere at the eastern edge, drawn with gold. Jerusalem, naturally, at the center, circled like a compass rose. Then, a riot of symbols, unicorns, griffins, men with faces in their chests, rivers that ran backward, and mountains shaped like towers. Maps, in the Middle Ages, were not instruments of travel. They were tools of teaching, doctrine, and control. The bishops who curated these strange cartographies weren't concerned with scale or roads. Their job was to keep the world theologically correct, not geographically sound. Heaven was quite literally up, and hell quite literally below. But how did these strange maps become so important? It began quietly in monasteries, in cathedrals, with slow hands copying even slower texts. Bishops gathered knowledge not through voyages, but through manuscript inheritance. By the 12th century, as cathedrals swelled in size and faith held its strongest, grip maps became theological statements. They were not drawn to scale. Africa, for example, might be smaller than England. The Holy Land, however, was massive ways dominating. One famous text, the Imago Mundi, declared that the world had 3 main continents: Asia, Europe, and Africa, each descending from Noah's sons. This genealogy of geography fit neatly with church teachings. The bishop's map showed it clearly, even when the real world did not. Time itself bent on these maps. Miles apart, yet in reality, centuries divided them. The maps were often created not on flat desks, but on scrolling parchment or calfskin, stretched, tight, layered with pigments made of crushed shells, ochres, and plant dyes. Candlelight would flicker against the edges. Dust would settle in the grooves. And still, these maps would hang in churches, not libraries. They were meant to be read aloud, explained like scripture. They told believers where they stood in God's creation quite literally. It was theology in ink, geography as belief. But what happened when kingdoms started using them to chart real journeys? The problems began slowly, first with a crusade. A French noble, Count Louis of Blois, famously prepared his journey to the Holy Land using a cathedral map, said to show the true path to Jerusalem, the center of the world. As always, but when his army reached the coast, their ships sailed in circles, misled by charts that confused cities with parables. On the bishop's map, the Nile might spring from paradise. The Alps were often drawn as a wall of teeth, and the distance between Paris and Acre anyone's guess. No one truly questioned the maps. They were divine, after all. In the courts of kings, royal advisors copied from cathedral parchments. Cartographers, who were still mostly monks, filled royal libraries with illuminated diagrams. Every new ruler wanted a map made in the true order of the Lord's world. But faith can be a poor compass. In one infamous case, King Roger II of Sicily, who favored science and hired Islamic geographers, commissioned a world map in the 12th century that placed Mecca near the center, not Jerusalem. The result? His court was accused of heresy. The maps were hidden. Elsewhere, soldiers and merchants set sail for cities that didn't exist. One kingdom prepared to trade with dog-headed men who were said to live east of India. Another sent monks to seek Prester John, a Christian king in the east who, according to the Mappa Mundi, ruled a land of wonders. He did not exist. Even England, fogged and muddy as it was, believed itself closer to Eden than the desert sands of Africa. On bishops' maps, distance was drawn by importance. Holy places were large. Pagan lands were small. The more sacred a region, the bigger it appeared. This meant armies walked farther than they expected. In the year 1256, a group of knights traveled toward the edge of the known world to seek allies against the Mongols. They brought with them a bishop's map, which showed the kingdom of Gog and Magog near China lands that were said to be cursed. The knights arrived instead at the camp of Kublai Khan, bewildered, tired, and very lost. Meanwhile, peasants and pilgrims followed painted signposts, trusting what they'd seen in stained glass and parchment. Some wandered for years. It was not malicious, just mistaken. These maps, despite their errors, were made with care. Gold leaf for holy mountains, tiny inked cities with square towers, leviathans in the sea. Monks took pride in these works, not as tools, but as prayers on skin. And as the centuries turned, the gap between belief and terrain grew. Sailors in the 14th century began bringing back real maps drawn from stars, not scripture. The Portolan charts, the compass rose, but the bishops weren't ready to let go. In fact, the older maps were still copied, even as ships now used newer ones. The two systems lived side by side, one for faith, one for fact, and the kings often preferred the prettier one because a bishop's map told a good story, even if it took you nowhere. As we'll explore in the final section, these belief maps didn't just mislead travelers. They shaped how entire generations imagined the world and what lurked at its edges. There was no funeral for the bishop's maps, no bell toll, no folded robes. They simply fitted quite like candlelight at dawn. By the late 15th century, the world was unraveling faster than ink could keep up. Columbus sailed west, guided not by a cathedral wall, but by newer charts drawn with compass and quadrant. He found land, not Eden, but land all the same. Meanwhile, in Florence and Lisbon and Toledo, mathematicians inked coastlines by angle, not angel. Their maps were ugly at first, functional. No dragons, no saints, no rivers springing from the garden, just bays and bearings, but they worked. Merchants brought spices home faster. Armies stopped marching toward myths. Kingdoms in faith, but in longitude. And so the bishop's maps were gently laid aside, not banned, not burned, just ignored. Still, they didn't entirely disappear, for in dusty monastery shelves and beneath cathedral eaves, those grand parchments remained, unrolled only on feast days, admired by candlelight, whispered over like sacred relics. They were never meant to be true, not in the way a compass is true. They were spiritual diagrams, theological diagrams, a mirror not of terrain, but of meaning. And though their time as guides had passed, their imagery never truly left us. You see it even now, when we imagine the edge of the world. What comes to mind? A cliff, perhaps, a sea pouring off the globe, sea monsters, the edge of knowledge. That's the bishop's doing. When a storyteller draws a medieval map for a fantasy world, it often resembles the old Mappa Mundi, large cities out of scale, monsters in the margins, a glowing center. Not because it's accurate, but because it feels true. These maps were not about where things were. They were about what mattered. Even now, we still draw importance larger than distance. Consider how subway maps are drawn, distorted for clarity, or how world maps still exaggerate Europe's size compared to Africa. Even in the modern age, we haven't escaped the habit of warping space to fit story. The bishop's way lingers in our thinking and in the hush of old libraries. Some of those maps still hang, stiff parchment, cracked edges, gold leaf halos fading, monks and beasts and sons and saints, silent, smiling, slightly wrong, but still beautiful. There's something soothing about them, as if to say, the world may be vast, but it makes sense at least on parchment, so we leave the final margin uncorrected. Let there be a corner still marked here, be lions. Let the wind still blow from the cheeks of angels. Let the seas still swirl with creatures never seen. For, in the end, perhaps, we don't always need maps to get us somewhere. Sometimes, we need them just to imagine. Dried figs and worn ink. The merchant of Alwyn Marketin, the town of Alwyn, nestled in the southern valleys of Verindel. A man named Aldrich kept a quiet stall in the market square. His goods were modest, dried figs, salt, beeswax, and ribbons, and his voice rarely rose above a whisper. Aldrich was known for his honesty, his even temper, and his ledger, a thick, weathered book bound in old leather, which he carried with a reverence usually reserved for relics or holy texts. He recorded every transaction in fine, looping script. But more than prices and trades, he wrote details. Weather, mood, which way the guards were looking, who seemed distracted, what was missing from another stall. He never said why he did it, and no one asked. He was simply the market's quiet observer. its human calendar. At dusk, when the stalls closed and smoke curled from chimneys, Aldrich retired to a loft above the cooper's shop. There he boiled lentils, sharpened his quills, and reread his entries. He annotated prices, added notes about sudden shortages, tracked which travelers had passed through, and quietly built a pattern from the details. When the crown sent new taxes on salt, wool, and honey, Aldrich was among the first to notice shifts. Cheese grew scarce. Pickled fish doubled in price. Nobles bought less wine. It was not spoken aloud, but Aldrich saw the ripple, and still he wrote. He added a new section to his book, a page tracking shortages, a second for unusual traffic, a third for changes in the soldiers' routes. His notes became denser, the ink darker. His fire burned lower as he stayed up longer, documenting a town that didn't know it was changing. And somewhere within those pages, a detail slept small, overlooked, that would soon draw eyes from the capital, far beyond the valley, and wake a kingdom from its fiscal slumber. Ink that spoke to Muchet was a rainy morning when two men from the royal court arrived. Their robes were long, their boots too clean for the market's mud, and their eyes sharp. They spoke to no one, bought nothing, and yet by noon they sat with Aldrich in his loft. They asked politely about his ledger. Aldrich, bewildered but calm, showed them the pages. They skimmed without comment until they reached a note about a wine shipment. A noble, supposedly ill, had purchased 10 crates, but no delivery was seen. The same noble, Aldrich noted, also borrowed coin from a temple and had once sent servants to buy false ledgers from a scribe across town. The men said nothing for a while. Then they asked for a copy. Aldrich, cautious, agreed. For the next week, he made exact duplicates, quill stroke by stroke, of 6 months' records. When finished, the men bowed and left. Months passed. Alwyn remained quiet. Aldrich continued his work, but then rumors began to stir. A noble arrested, a scribe vanished, a temple sealed. Aldrich's name was never mentioned, but guards now nodded at him with unfamiliar courtesy. A clerk arrived with coin, a gift for civic diligence. Aldrich refused. His ledger grew. Now he included guards. Boots, were they worn, clean? Did they shift more often? Did their coats seem newer than last month? He added a section for wheat prices in towns upriver. He began to receive quiet visitors, scholars, scribes, auditors, each pretending to browse figs, each whispering questions about shipments, documents, names. One day, he wrote a single line. The book no longer belongs to me. He hid it after that, behind floorboards, beneath lentils. When the guards came again, friendly, polite, they asked if he still wrote. He smiled and said only a little. The ledger that echoed years later Aldrich was gone. His stall stood empty. Some said he died quietly in winter. Others said he moved north, beyond the rivers. But the ledger remained. It passed to a monk, then a minister, then to the royal treasury, where it sat forgotten on a shelf for decades. Then came a famine. No one knew why. The crops had not failed entirely. The rivers still flowed, yet prices soared, trade slowed. The market bent under unseen weight. Councils argued. No answer. Until one clerk, buried in accounts, found a note, a copied entry from a merchant in Alwyn, describing a pattern of missing weight in lentil sacks and odd doubling of price where trade routes cross. The king's men read the ledger again, page by page. They traced a pattern back 20 years, smuggling routes, misweighing habits, false accounts masked by festival shipments. And from it, reforms came, honest weights, open records, audits modeled after Aldrich's notes. They never found the original book. Some say it burned. Others say a librarian sold it to a collector for its binding alone. But echoes of its method remained in every town that now recorded trade, in every clerk that wrote more than numbers. Aldrich lived on. He had not changed a kingdom with war or gold or protest, only with ink, quiet, soft ink that watched, waited, and recorded what others missed. He did not seek glory. He only sought clarity. And sometimes that's all history needs, to remember you. The fog rolled over Cobbleminster before dawn, thick as milk, swallowing chimneys and lanterns in a ghostly hush. A carriage passed through the southern gate, its wheels creaking against uneven stone, its velvet-lined interior holding no noble entourage, only a single figure wrapped in burlap and travel dust. No guards, no trumpets, no herald of royalty. Only the low murmur of hooves and breath in the bakery near the town square. A squat little structure squashed between a tanner's yard and a chapel wall. Ovens already glowed orange in the half-dark. The air hung heavy with sourdough and scorched rye. Mistress Ida, the baker, stirred a bucket of flour with arms like bread paddles, her apron stained with years of dough and wood smoke. She didn't notice the figure watching from the alley, shadowed beneath a dripping cloak. Not at first. He came in silently as the door creaked, nodding at the cat before he nodded at the baker. He smelled like travel, like horse, like memory. Looking for work, lad, Etta said, barely turning. He nodded again, quietly setting down a coin purse, worn thin with fingers. It bore the faint insignia of something noble, barely visible under soot and oil. She looked at him closer, squinting. The boy's hands were soft, too soft for firewood or butcher's work. His speech, when it came, was clipped and precise. I learn fast, he said, placing his hands on the table like offerings. She shrugged. Start with sifting. And that was how the royal vanished. Not in death, not in war, but into yeast and morning loaves. But his hands learned fast. He sifted flour with the care of a monk, dusting relics. He folded dough with the quiet reverence of prayer. And by the second week, Mistress Etta admitted under her breath that his shaping of sweet rolls was finer than any she'd seen since the old guild baker died with a raisin in his throat. Yet something never sat quite right. He flinched when town criers shouted news of missing nobility. He stirred at the sound of distant hoofbeats, eyes darting to the shuttered window. He recoiled slightly when children asked innocent questions. One small girl, clutching a penny bun, peered up at him and asked plainly, "Why do you smell like cinnamon and sadness?" Tom had smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Etta noticed, but said nothing. Cobbleminster was a town that respected quiet secrets. In the castle, 2 valleys away, torches burned late into the night. Scribes pored over ledgers, knights barked at servants, and the queen, red-eyed and stiff-necked, sat with a cold cup of wine, refusing to cry where anyone could see. Prince Theobald was missing, not kidnapped, not assassinated, missing. All they found was a note left in his study, folded once and left beside A crumbling biscuit. I am going where I can be useful, not ornamental. The queen crushed the biscuit in her hand. Back in Cobbleminster, Tom had found his rhythm. He rose with the crows, donned the same soot-dusted cloak each morning, and had flour on his eyelashes by sunrise. The bakery had begun to prosper. The morning queues lengthened, for the new boy had a knack for flavor pairings that defied logic and flour rations. Honey lavender crumbles, pear sage biscuits, spiced fig loaves that made the friars weep quietly into their collars. Yet Tom refused to speak of himself. Etta stopped asking. She knew a nobleman when she saw one, even wrapped in soot and yeast, but secrets in Cobbleminster never stayed asleep forever. One morning, just before Epiphany, a traveling official from the Royal Census Office arrived. He came with nothing more than a cracked ledger, a brass seal, and the world's worst timing. New workers must be registered, he barked. Even apprentices, Ida grunted. He's just a helper. The official frowned, flipping pages. A tall one. What's his family name? None to give, Etta said flatly. He's flower-born now. The man wasn't amused. I'll be back with a bailiff if he's not named. The door slammed, and Tom's face went pale. That night, as the ovens cooled and snow hissed against the windows, if only it were this easy, he whispered. Edd, watching from the doorway, stepped in. You're a prince, then? He nodded once, slowly, as though admitting it made it real again. She didn't bow, she didn't gasp, she merely dusted her hands and said, "Well, you roll dough better than you rule, I imagine." He laughed, a short, surprised bark of a laugh. The first real sound from him in weeks. "Why here?" she asked. He shrugged. "Because here I feed people. I'm not a symbol. I'm a part of something." "Then you're daft," she said, "but useful daft." By spring, word reached Cobbleminster in hushed tones. Prince Theobald had been declared dead. The court held a symbolic burial with an empty casket. Black banners fluttered. A marble statue was ordered. A street was renamed in his memory, though the cobbler refused to change his business cards for months. And in the bakery, flour dust rising like incense, Tom kept kneading. The loaf that outlived a thrown spring passed into summer with the lazy certainty of dough rising under warm linen. Cobbleminster's cobbled lanes bloomed with gossip and wild marjoram. The bakery's scent became its own kind of town bell. When the pear loaves baked, it was mid-morning. When the fig biscuits cooled, it was nearly church time. And when the honey-crust braids were pulled from the oven, the sun was ready to set behind the cloister roof, and Tom, still Tom, moved through it all like a shadow given weight. The villagers accepted him the way they accepted strange, whether cautiously, but with warm coats and better stories. Children whispered tales of how he spoke in riddles, or baked with dragon's breath, or knew the names of every raven in the north. Some claimed he had fairy blood. Others said he was a saint in exile. Ida said nothing at all. She let him bake. Years passed. The crown had changed hands. The queen, old and silent, was finally laid to rest beneath a slab of limestone, her face carved in rigid sorrow. Her youngest daughter, now queen herself, was crowned beneath banners of silver gray. Mourning, still clinging to the velvet hems of her robes, she ordered old ledgers reviewed. One in particular caught her eye. The case of Prince Theobald, her uncle, declared dead, the steward confirmed. No body, no sign, just his final note. The new queen read the words twice. I am going where I can be useful, not ornamental. She stared out the window, then quietly requested the census records of Cobbleminster. The town clerk grumbled when he found it, an unnamed assistant, unregistered for years, tall, quiet, remarkable in pastry arts, described once by a tax agent as a man with the bearing of nobility and the flower stains of a saint. The queen packed a carriage. It was late summer when she arrived, not in splendor, but in a gray cloak and dusty shoes. No fanfare, no guards, just curiosity. She walked into the bakery unnoticed at first, until Tom looked up from scoring a crust and froze. She looked like her mother, only softer. He bowed. Don't, she said, not to me. Ida appeared from the back and squinted. Royal, are you? Yes, said the queen. Then sit. You're letting the heat out. And just like that, a monarch had tea in the back of a bakery, her crown packed away. Her questions, UNASKED. Tom served lemon-thyme biscuits, still warm. They spoke for an hour, maybe two. No one heard what was said, only that when the queen rose to leave, her eyes were wet and her hands powdered with flour from an absent-minded touch to the counter. She said nothing to the people outside, no announcement, no summons, just a small nod. And then she was gone. 2 winters later, Cobbleminster's bakery was awarded a royal charter of restoration. No explanation. The mayor puffed himself up in the ceremony, but everyone knew. They knew without knowing. The way you know which way the river flows, by how it wears the stone. Ida passed in her sleep during the fall of her 81st year. She left. No will, only a smudged note tucked in a recipe book. The boy can keep the oven. He knows what to do with fire. Tom aged gracefully, his hair grayed like sifted flour, his shoulders bent not from burden, but from years of kneading. He kept baking. Children grew into adults on the scent of his morning rolls. Lovers met beside his shelves. Songs were written about the caramel crust of his spiced plum bread. He never married, never left. When asked why, he'd smile faintly and say, because the crown taught me how to be seen, but the oven taught me how to be useful. He died one spring morning, just as the bees began returning to the windowsill time. They say his hands were still dusted with flour, and his last breath smelled faintly of cinnamon when the news reached the capital. The queen, much older now, ordered a single thing, that no statue be made, only a loaf, a simple honey oat round, baked once a year, and left on the bakery windowsill of Cobbleminster. No inscription, just the warmth, just the memory, just the memory, just the scent of a prince who vanished not in battle or scandal, but into the heart of bread. In the narrow curve of Hollowwind Alley, a place where the fog never seemed to lift, and the cobbles stayed slick with drizzle, no matter the season, lived a man few remembered, though nearly every noble relied upon his work. His name was Elion Farwhistle, and he was the last royal cartographer not yet dismissed, dead, or entirely forgotten. Hollowwind Alley was no place for royalty, nor for crafts of any official standing. But that was perhaps why Elion preferred it. The walls there slanted inwards with age, the roof tiles hung loose like old teeth, and the air tasted of chimney soot and stale bread. It suited him perfectly. Elion's quarters were stacked floor to ceiling with maps, half finished, fading, curled in on themselves like ancient fern fronds. he never threw one away. In every corner was a pile of parchment, too warped to hang, too fragile to flatten. Lines ran through them in dark ink, some spidery, some bold, some that had bled when rain leaked through the beams. Candles burned constantly, even by daylight, for his room had only one cracked window, and even that faced a brick wall across the way. Most days he worked by flicker and shadow. He had a method. Each morning began with a steep kettle of chamomile and a glance at the flame of his brass lamp. He'd learned long ago how to read the mood of the day in the way it danced, whether steady, whether shivering. On the days the flame stood tall, maps came easily. On the days it wobbled, he drew with hesitation, always wary of what mistake might come from a trembling hand or misread bearing. But it was his candle, his constant companion. It had guided him true for nearly 27 years. Not that anyone truly checked his work anymore. Kings had grown impatient with maps, now preferring court whispers, informants, and marching orders given by whim. The roads were known, the rivers named. What use, then, for a man who fussed over compass roses and land contours with such devotion? And yet Elion was still summoned once or twice a year to produce a new border chart or redraft a coastline that no longer matched some taxman's account. His maps were less documents and more decoration, admired for their artistry more than their accuracy. He didn't mind. There was peace in quiet relevance, but on one particular winter morning, as sleet whispered down the alley in wind-blown flurries, and a rat gnawed loudly behind the wainscot, a courier arrived. Young, sharp-chinned, and shivering in boots, too. Thin for ice, he held out a sealed note with the royal crest waxy, smeared, and clearly pressed in haste. For Master Farwhistle, he mumbled, glancing into the gloom of the shop. By order of the crown, Elion opened it with the practiced hand of someone who had opened such orders all his life, slowly, letting the paper warm in his palm first, as if that might reveal something about its intent. The message inside was brief, rushed, and bore the hand of someone far below nobility. It asked for a map, a very specific map. The northern passes of Avimore, lands long left blank by decree, were now to be charted in full. The timing was strange. Winter storms were still choking the high trails. No travelers had reported through those routes in months. But the note was clear. The king required a chart of the northbound forks, valley routes, and cave symbols near the Redridge, to be delivered in 3 days. Elion stared at the flame again. Today it leaned to one side, fluttering in a way that made it seem unsure. He lit a second candle beside it. Both leaned that night. Elion pulled out maps that hadn't seen light in decades, some inherited, others pieced together from fragments. His fingers brushed over ancient paths, forgotten watchtowers, symbols drawn by cartographers long since buried. The passes of Avamore were a place of silence and superstition. Roads, once patrolled, now overgrown, paths erased by time and refusal. It was said that anyone who drew them in full would bring misfortune, that certain landmarks belonged only to the old ways, and ink alone could not hold them. He did not believe in curses, but he did believe in mistakes. And so he worked slowly. By the second evening, the map had shape. He had charted ridges by memory, added streams from archived expedition journals, and even marked the outline of an ancient fortress that had never been officially acknowledged. The flame flickered wildly as he drew it. He hesitated, but the fortress had to be noted. It was part of the terrain. On the third morning, as he prepared to package the scroll, he noticed something odd. The ink on one part of the map was still wet, days old, but slick. When he touched it, the mark smeared. Elion frowned. He reached for a clean quill and tried to blot the mark, but the ink refused to lift. It shimmered faintly, like oil or breath. For the first time in years, he shivered. The courier returned just before dusk, eyes wide at the sudden gale that had come down the alley. Elion handed over the scroll, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with waxed string. Neither spoke. After the door closed, the room was quiet again, save for the soft sound of the candle flickering. It was shorter than it had been, and Elion, for the first time, could not remember lighting it that day. Ink that drew to much the royal courier's boots had barely dried from his journey down. Hollowwind Alley, before the map, was unfurled in the winter chamber of the Lord Advisor's hall. The candlelight flickered against its inked valleys, its fine line work winking like frost. The nobles murmured praise. One even claimed the map to be elegant enough to eat. None noticed the faint shimmer in the ink, but one did notice something else. Captain Barrow, the youngest officer assigned to the Northern Watch, squinted at the mark of the old fortress. "There's no record of a keep near that ridge," he said flatly. "Not in any patrol logs." "Then perhaps it was buried in snow," offered Lord Advisor Wintron, who had never seen a ridge firsthand in his life. "Or perhaps the map-maker is embellishing. They tend to do that." Bureau didn't respond. He only stared harder. By morning, 2 small units had been dispatched. Their orders were to verify the trail lines and ridge passes of the Aviemore Forks, and, if possible, investigate the area near the marked fortress. It was assumed the fortress would not exist, but the soldiers didn't return. Not in 1 day, not in 2. On the 3rd day, only 1 man came back, limping, white-lipped, eyes full of frost and murmur. "There was something hollow," he muttered, gripping his frost-bitten fingers. "The pass. It bent where it shouldn't." The fortress it was. There, stones older than thought. No flag, but it breathed. The stone breathed. They declared him mad and confined him to the infirmary, wrapped in wool and silence. Elion heard nothing of this, not yet. He had not left his alley since the map was taken, but something had changed. The candles no longer burned properly there. Flames leaned constantly, as if responding to winds that didn't exist. Some sputtered out before burning halfway, and once a wick hissed as if drowned, though it had not touched oil or water. He began to notice patterns forming in the ash-curved lines, faint spirals, ink-black dust arranging itself across his desk like an echo. More unsettling was the map. The copy he had made, the one he kept for reference, had altered. It had grown. On the 4th night, Elion awoke to find the map unrolled across his table, though he swore he had stored it. A new ridge had appeared, one he had not drawn. It branched off the main pass like a forked tongue, narrow and descending, and near it another mark, a pool or perhaps a ruin. Not in his hand, not in his ink. He did not touch it. He simply lit a new candle, sat down, and stared. The map changed again on the 5th day. He watched it this time as the candle burned low. The parchment seemed to stretch, as though the fibers themselves were remembering something. Thin lines etched slowly across the page, too faint to be noticed immediately, but clear by dawn. Not random, not decorative. Measured. A second fortress, smaller than the first, but not a ruin. This time, the ink shimmered, slightly violet. Elion tried to scrub it away. The mark did not budge. It felt oily under the cloth, as though it pulsed by midday. A knock came at his door. Captain Barrow stood there, face pale, eyes hard. "Master Farwhistle," he said, "you're to come with me." "To where?" Elion asked, though he already suspected the Redridge Fork. "We need your eyes. No one can make sense of what we found. And your ink seems to know more than our maps." Elion didn't argue. He packed a satchel of old charts, several candles, and one of the earliest compasses he owned, a brass one that spun true only when the candlelight was steady. The path to the Redridge took 2 days on horseback. The trail grew colder by the mile, though the snow did not deepen. It was the kind of cold that lived in stone, in the marrow. Trees thinned, shadows stretched. They arrived at dusk, there, beneath the cliffs of Avamore, where no one remembered a keep, stood one. The fortress was built into the stone itself, with archways like open mouths and towers too slim for anything to live in. Wind passed through it, and the sound it made was not quite a howl, but not quite words either. The soldiers who had arrived before them stood in a distant circle. No one stepped closer, not anymore. Barrow gestured to Elion. "We found this beside the gate," he said, handing over a parchment. It was torn, stiff from cold. It was a map. Elli unrecognized the hand. It was his, but he had never drawn this one. On it were not just the keep, but stairwells beneath it, layers, caverns, and a mark in the deepest chamber. A candle. Next to the mark was a single word, in a language Elion hadn't written in years. Breath. The candle that never went out. The fortress gates did not open. They were not locked. They simply refused. Captain Barrow tried first, pressing a gloved hand to the stone, then his shoulder. The surface was smooth as river-washed bone. No hinges, no seams, only the shape of a door that didn't believe in being opened. "It's drawn," Elion murmured. Barrow turned to him. "What? It's drawn," he repeated, slower this time, staring at the door. "This isn't a gate. It's an illusion, made of memory, a shape copied from something older, something forgotten." He stepped closer. From his satchel, he drew a single beeswax candle, the same kind he used to sketch by. He lit it with a match. The flame trembled once, then stilled. The wind, once sharp as a blade, stopped howling. Then the door began to dissolve, not crumble, not break, but fade, like chalk brushed from a slate. Beyond it, darkness stretched, far deeper than stone should allow. They entered with only the candle to guide them. The interior of the fortress was colder than outside, but not in a way that made skin shiver. It was the cold of silence, of stone without time. The architecture did not follow human logic's tears that led sideways. Arches that framed empty space, narrow slits in the walls that whispered as they passed. Yet the candle stayed lit. Elli held it ahead like a compass. "Where are we going?" Barrow asked once. "I don't know," Elion said, truthfully, "but the map knows." And it did. Every chamber they crossed matched the strange map given to him at the gate. Twists, hallways, forgotten halls. He walked as if remembering a dream, At times, he stumbled. At times, the candle seemed to lean, showing him which way to go. Finally, they reached it, a final chamber, circular, domed with obsidian stone. In the center, a pedestal. Upon it a candle, unlit, but not cold. Elyon approached. He bent slowly, reverently, and held his own flame to the unlit one. The new wick caught instantly. No flicker, no sputter. A perfect, steady burn. Light filled the chamber, but it did not behave like normal light. It curved, folded. It moved through carvings on the wall, and those carvings began to animate lines, forming mountains, roads, rivers. A map, unlike any other. Alive. Barrow stared, breath shallow. What is this? Elyon didn't answer. He didn't know. But the candle in his hand guttered suddenly and died. The pedestal flame remained. Elyon stepped back, a voice not heard, but felt moved through the room like dust on air. Mapmaker, it said, we remember. And the walls moved, not with sound, but with shape. The map engraved itself deeper into stone, and new lines etched into the floor beneath their feet. Outside the fortress, a pulse moved through the cliffs, the soldiers waiting. At camp, felt it in their teeth, in their bones. The wind rose, then vanished, inside. Barrow and Elyon stood in the candle's glow. We have awakened something, Barrow whispered. Elli unnodded. Or it has simply returned. The candle on the pedestal flared once, then dimmed to a low, constant glow. The carvings on the wall settled. The new map was done, but not drawn, breathed back in Hollowwind Alley. Weeks later, a merchant found the old mapmaker's house shuttered and dark. Dust had collected under the door. No candles burned in the window. On his desk lay a map. It pulsed slightly, and above it, etched in the wood by no hand, were the words, "Let none draw in darkness." And so the threads were spun, not of war or glory, but of quiet defiance and delicate silk. Arachne remained, not as a girl, but as a whisper in the rafters, weaving still, long after gods stopped watching. Athena turned away. The contest was over, yet the story clung, soft, slow, and silent, like a spider's web in the dark. If your eyes have drifted, let them rest. If your mind is quiet, let it stay that way. And if you'd like more myths that don't shout, just stories that sigh, subscribe for another sleepy tale sometime soon.